This is Tarheel Talk, an in-depth look at the issues and people making news in North Carolina. Here's your host, Sonia Williams.
According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, almost every country in the world is affected by human trafficking. On today's show, we'll learn more about human trafficking, what it is, what it looks like in our community, and what you can do to help put an end to it. And joining me now is Lizzie Adams, Public Relations Director for the Salvation Army of Wake County. Lizzie, welcome back to Tarheel Talk.
Thank you.
Now, thanks to a lot of public information campaigns, a lot of public awareness campaigns and documentaries, we're now becoming more familiar with the term human trafficking, but there are still a lot of people who don't really understand what exactly that is. So can you just start by telling us a little bit about what is considered human trafficking?
Absolutely. So human trafficking is often referred to as modern day slavery. And that's essentially what it is. It's anyone, men, women, children, being exploited either for sex or labor purposes. And so what we tend to see is three components of that, and that's force, fraud, or coercion that traffickers use to essentially enslave these people. And so what that may look like, instead of what we think of as slavery, there are a lot of connotations that come into mind, maybe like locks and chains and people being physically forced into things, and that does happen. But when you start to use these other elements of force, fraud, and coercion, it doesn't always look like that. So sometimes it's more of like mental locks and chains and that sort of thing. So they're threatening their family members or holding things over their head, whether it be forcing them to pay off some sort of debt that may or may not be real. So they're creating these mental locks and chains, an environment that they can't get out of.
And we talk about that, and a lot of times that when we think about human trafficking, some people may feel like, oh, that happened somewhere else. That doesn't necessarily happen here, but at the Salvation Army of Wake County, you have a project called Project Fight NC, which is primarily for victims of human trafficking. So talk a little bit about the prevalence of human trafficking here in North Carolina, and particularly in the Triangle.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. A lot of times if people do know about human trafficking, which is great, they think of it as elsewhere. Right. It's not a problem here in the U.S., most certainly not in our backyard, but unfortunately that's just not the case. In 2011, Salvation Army of Wake County founded Project Fight, which stands for Freeing Individuals Gripped by Human Trafficking. So when that program started, it was grant funded, and we didn't know what we were going to encounter. So it had a projection of hitting 12 cases over the course of 2 years. Within the first 2 months, we had already encountered 12 cases, and we're still seeing referrals. And so that told us right there, this is a huge issue. What we found in that short period of time is that we were getting calls not only from the Triangle, but from across the state. And so what we've started to see as a trend is that North Carolina consistently ranks within the top 10 states for human trafficking, and which is surprising to me.
And it's frightening.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's an issue in our home state, and most certainly in the Triangle. What we've seen over the past several years is we've encountered even more victims. So the first couple of years, it was anywhere between 30 to maybe 50, and in 2015, we had over 108 referrals. And so
that's here in the Triangle.
Oh my goodness. So we're representing the state, but primarily most of those referrals were based right out of the Triangle. So Raleigh, Cary, Durham, Wake Forest, what we call our home, our community, our backyard.
So give us an idea, as best as you can, of what human trafficking looks like here. What types of referrals are you getting? What situations are people in where they feel like they need assistance?
Absolutely. Well, it's a good question. So we've created a great partnership. It's very much a collaborative effort. A part of it is raising awareness about what is human trafficking, exactly what we're talking about right now. And the other part is making sure that service providers, mental health care providers, medical providers, law enforcement understand that A, this is happening, and B, can start to recognize it. So we've been so grateful for, in this community, we've had a tremendous partnership with Raleigh PD, Cary PD, even extending out to Fayetteville and so on. And what we've done is created these training programs, and they've worked with us, and so they're starting to identify victims and starting to, maybe ask a few more questions. So maybe it presents itself as one thing, whether it might be a domestic abuse situation or it might look like prostitution, but when you start to ask a few more of those questions, you realize that's not that, that's almost a mask. It's actually human trafficking. And so about 40% of our referrals come from law enforcement. Again, which is great. We're starting to, work together. And actually, in the past 6 months, we were invited to participate in an operation with 3 federal agencies: Homeland Security, FBI, U.S. Marshals, but then also local FBI and then PD. So it's been great to be a part of that process. And so we're able to assist those victims right off the bat and work collaboratively to serve not only their specific needs, but hopefully to, pursue these traffickers and get them so they aren't further exploiting other individuals.
And when you talk about exploiting individuals, and you're saying that this can be children, men, women, there is no particular group of people or age group that is singled out. It really is across the board.
Absolutely. So it's hard, when you ask, what does it look like? There's no one way to describe it. People, they look like you and me in some instances. There's no one set criteria or anything, but what we do tend to find is that this one commonality of vulnerability. So what does that look like? It could be a teenager with low self-esteem. It could be maybe a child that's gone in and out of foster care, doesn't have or just has a lack of support. And that could be a child, that could be an adult. So we see all these different kind of phases or stages of vulnerability, and that's where it comes into play, where traffickers identify that and exploit that vulnerability. So maybe it comes across as, a young girl who is insecure, isn't very confident, but suddenly this guy takes an interest in her, and he makes her feel loved and appreciated in ways that she hasn't experienced. And then slowly, or maybe not so slowly, that starts to turn. And so they've created this attachment that feels healthy, but suddenly they're asked either to do things, more than likely forced to do things that they would otherwise, of course, not want to.
Right.
And so that's really hard. And it is across the board, like you said. We've seen men, women, and children, ages and range anywhere between 9 to 63 years old over the past 4 or 5 years. And that's shocking, and it's hard to hear. And unfortunately, it's not a pretty picture. These are people that, they want everything that you and I want. They want a better life. They want education, and people, these traffickers use that and turn it against them.
Exactly.
We've seen both foreign-born and domestic-born victims. A lot of times they're exploiting those wants. One person wanted to go to college. She'd worked her entire life to get there, got there, and was just wanting to make some extra money. A guy approached her and said, "You know what? You could do some modeling." She's like, "Okay, on the weekends? That works with my schedule. That's great." Turns out, one thing led to another. He want to be really careful about confidentiality, so I don't want to say too much. Was able to basically trick her and then use video footage over her so that she was picked up Friday, prostituted, or not prostituted, but exploited over the weekend, and then was dropped off Sunday evening, and no one knew. Right. And to this day, her family members don't know.
Definitely takes on many different forms and difficult to identify just from a general description. We're going to take a break and talk more about this issue in just a minute. We'll be back with more on human trafficking after these messages. Today's show focuses on human trafficking and efforts underway to help educate the public about this crime. The Salvation Army has launched Project Fight, or Freeing Individuals Gripped by Human Trafficking, in North Carolina. And with us again to tell us more about Project Fight is Lizzie Adams, Director of Public Relations with the Salvation Army of Wake County. Now, Lizzie, before the break, you were talking a little bit about some of the particular incidences of human trafficking, but as we were talking during the break, you made an excellent point of just saying the word trafficking implies movement, and I think it's important that our viewers understand that a person doesn't necessarily have to be from another country or another area for an incident to be considered human trafficking.
Absolutely. So, like we were saying, even the term trafficking can be confusing because it implies movement. Which is not the case. I mean, we do see where people are being brought over from different countries, but the majority of the cases that we see are actually what we would call domestic clients. They're born and raised in the U.S., North Carolina or whatever other state. But to be trafficked, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be moved from place to place to place from another country across state lines. You can be trafficked from one house, one room for years on end. I mean, so it doesn't necessarily have to be where you're being transferred over and over. It just is being implied that, this is happening to you against your will.
And the Salvation Army is, like I said, has launched this campaign, this project, Project Fight, to try to help victims of human trafficking. Talk a little bit about Project Fight and the number of services and outreach efforts that you provide.
Absolutely. So Project Fight, again, started about 4 years ago, or I guess 5 at this point, 2011, and it's a comprehensive case management program for victims of human trafficking. So it's both labor and sex trafficking, some instances, or both, foreign and domestic born. So what we're trying to do is when we encounter victims is go a holistic approach. So we try to be very victim-centered, individual cases, what are their needs? Those very basic kind of emergency items of shelter, safety, food, clothing, those are right off the bat, immediate. But then there's more of the long-term care. So connecting them with various services. We've had several different clients that have had severe medical issues because of their experiences. A lot of them severe trauma, which results in mental health needs. So we're connecting them with these different resources, and we try very much to hold an awareness of their trauma and work with them through it. So looking at their experiences, their reactions through maybe what we call a trauma-informed lens or trauma-informed care. So recognizing that the way that they approach different situations, the way that they view relationships, all of these different components has been affected by their past trauma, specifically through their experience with trafficking. And it's getting them to a place where they're able to have healthy connections and attachments and relationships. That's the goal, is that despite what you've been through, you're not broken. You're whole. You're a person just like you and me, and we're going to help you get to where you're living a normal, successful life.
How can people reach out and get help? What's the best way or best points of contact to get people connected to Project Fight?
Well, I have to thank you for having us on, because there are even people right now that may be viewing this that are kind of starting to connect the dots of, oh my gosh, this sounds like something I've been through. This sounds like something my friend or family member has been through. So just getting people to talk about it, to raise awareness, and if someone identifies and they themselves need help, they can call the national hotline with Polaris Project, and that number is 1-888-3737-888. So they can call there, and whether they seek help themselves or they have a tip, they have an idea, maybe someone who is being trafficked, they can call there. They can also go to our website, which is wakearmy.org. It will have all of our different services, and you can call even our front office, which is 919-834-6733. And then the Project Fight website is projectfightnc.org.
So there's lots of ways to get connected to the help and the resources that are there. I think for a lot of people, it is important, though, that just that awareness and being able to recognize it. What does it look like? What might be some of the red flags that I might see with, if I'm a teacher, a student, if I'm just living in a neighborhood, maybe one of my neighbors? What are some of the red flags that we may want to take heed to?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard one, though. We find with this crime, this violation of human rights, that not only is it hard to talk about because these are issues that a lot of people don't want to hear. They're not fun things, but also you know, it's kind of an invisible crime. It's happening kind of right in front of us because people are able to walk about as if they would, you know, either of us in their day-to-day activities. You look at labor trafficking, for instance. A lot of times it's people working in restaurants, working in hotels, working on farms that are being exploited for labor purposes. So, you know, they look like just every other worker, but what's happening is that they're not being compensated either at all or where they should be for the work that they're putting into it. So if you look at maybe just that, you might go into even a nail salon. If people aren't making eye contact with you, if there seems to be a very domineering personality over that person, you ask them questions and they're not readily responsive at all, that could be an indicator. And likewise, whether it's a hotel or a restaurant. So those might be some signs. What's hard is that might happen. It might not be trafficking. Right. You know, when you talk about nannying is even one. If you see a neighbor that always has a household nanny or household maid that is constantly there, that never really seems to leave, that, you know, you wave and they're not really, maybe not that friendly or just not really willing to interact, that might be a red flag. But you know that at the same time, that person just could be shy. So that's where it gets really difficult. But what we would kind of urge people, if you're interested in learning more, is we have different volunteer opportunities, and one is Project Fight Club. Volunteers can come together, learn more about trafficking, not only as a subject, but then what it might look like in our community, and especially for professionals. You know, what a training might look like for nurses, as far as like signs and red flags, might be different from a therapist.
Sure.
So we can cater those different trainings to whatever profession or whatever demographic we're talking to at the time.
And that awareness is just so crucial in helping to combat this crime, because it is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry or crime ring, if you will. So just the fact that it is so lucrative will make it even that much more difficult to address.
Absolutely. So worldwide, human trafficking is a $32 billion industry, which is incredible. It's second only to drugs. And so that when you think about that, it's the second largest criminal enterprise. I mean, that hopefully puts it in check for people of how severe this issue is. And that's only an estimate based on what we know. So, you know, if we look at even broader scope, let's say right now, an average of people coming into the U.S. who are being trafficked, so they're foreign-born being brought into the United States, is about 600 to 800,000 people, and that's not even domestic clients, and people that are experiencing that. So that's, again, just what we know, and because so much of that is invisible, is under the surface, is not readily identifiable, makes it even harder.
A huge issue that definitely is going to take a lot of work, a lot of community agencies and law enforcement officials working together to address. Lizzie, we're going to take a break. We'll talk more in just a minute. We'll be back with more Tar Heel Talk after these messages. Welcome back to Tar Heel Talk. I'm Sonia Williams. Studies show that almost every country in the world is affected by human trafficking. The United States, North Carolina, and the Triangle are no exceptions. The Salvation Army has launched a program that's working to provide awareness and support to human trafficking victims and the communities in which they live. And we've been talking today about Project Fight and its efforts, and with us again is Lizzie Adams, who is the Director of Public Relations with the Salvation Army of Wake County. Lizzie, this is certainly an important topic, but a very difficult topic, one, to understand, and then two, to talk about, because it involves young children all the way up to the elderly, and we're talking about people who are being forced to do things that they would not otherwise do. So it's a very difficult topic to talk about, but very important and very necessary given the prevalence of human trafficking in our area.
Absolutely, and it's hard. It really is to take the time to learn more about it, and it's a difficult concept because you're talking about people that have been, in some instances, tortured, beaten, to get them to do things that, like you said, otherwise they would not. But this is where we hope that it starts to click with people that, you know what, it's hard to hear, but in a way it's necessary because I don't want to hear about it even more. I don't want it happening to my neighbors, to my loved ones. So we're hoping that people, even though it's difficult, start to kind of take a stand and just start to lend an ear, because just getting people to talk about it is so huge, because that's where education really is such a key component to combating this issue.
And you talked earlier in the show about the prevalence of human trafficking here in North Carolina and particularly in the Triangle area. Talk a little bit more about that and remind our viewers of the prevalence, particularly in the Triangle, and why that is happening.
We have a lot of great things about where we live. I mean, tons of wonderful universities and a lot of different jobs and companies and all of these wonderful things. So what tends to happen is that people hear about that. We have more and more population. So anywhere you start to have dense populations of people is unfortunately where you're going to start to see more prevalence of trafficking, whether that be sex or labor trafficking. And unfortunately, a lot of it also comes into play with either gangs and other violent crimes. So they start to kind of overlap each other, and then you see this almost breeding process, I guess you could say, of where it starts in one area and then it starts to overlap. So in the Triangle, we have so many great things. I don't want to ever talk negatively about it, and I'm hoping that, because we're starting to talk about it, people will recognize this is a great community, and we want to take care of it, and we want to take care of those that are being exploited.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, it's growing. And some of that could be because we are raising awareness. We're starting to recognize these signs, and we're starting to recognize this population and take a stand for them. And so we're seeing those increased numbers. But what we hope is that by doing so, we're going to eventually eradicate it. So not only is it addressing awareness, but in some instances, we have to address the issue of demand, both for sex and for labor.
Absolutely, and that's an incredibly important point, because it's, like you were mentioning, a multi-billion-dollar industry, a year industry, and it would not be so if there were not a demand.
Yeah, I mean, we look at the basic economic lesson of supply and demand, and what is happening here is, human trafficking is second only to drugs. So with drugs, you sell one time, that product is used. With a human, you're selling them over and over. In essence, they're becoming a reusable commodity. No one ever wants, you don't want to think of people that way.
Right.
No one should ever be thought of that way.
Absolutely.
And so I think when we start to put it in that kind of context, we all need to say, that's enough. And so addressing the demand is really a huge issue, because it's not just affecting the people being exploited. It's not just affecting their families. It's affecting all of us in some way, shape, or form. And so once we start to raise education and awareness, then we need to start looking at demand and saying, that's enough.
Right. There may be someone watching this morning who may be in a situation that they know they're being exploited. There is help. Tell people how they can get that help.
They can, if it's an immediate, dire emergency situation, they can call 911. And if they identify as a victim of human trafficking, law enforcement is going to exactly know what to do. And then that's where we come into play. If they encounter a victim, they're going to go ahead and call us, call a partner agency, and we're going to actually activate what we call our rapid response team. And so within the first 72 hours, we're going to address all those immediate needs and then shift over into long-term care. So whether they call 911 and speak and say, I'm potentially a victim of human trafficking, or if they want to call the Polaris hotline, that 1-888-3737-888, and they can receive assistance that way.
Right, so it's just important to know that there is help available.
Absolutely.
There's help here locally, and just pick up the phone, and assistance is just a phone call away.
Yep, exactly, just a phone call.
Well, Lizzie Adams, Director of Public Relations with the Salvation Army of Wake County, we certainly thank you for shedding some light on this very important issue, and just thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you so much. This is a first step, so thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. That's it for this week's Tar Heel Talk. To comment on this or other episodes of the show, send us a message on our Facebook page or an email to tarheeltalk@fox50.com. I'm Sonia Williams. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week.